Well, welcome to Don't Know Much About, where it always begins with a question. Today, I am joined by Sam J. Hyde, a young thought leader from South Africa. Sam is currently a fellow at the Jewish People Policy Institute and a columnist for the Jerusalem Post. After completing his studies in journalism, Sam worked at the Cape Town Holocaust Center's Department for the Study of Contemporary Anti-Semitism, where he examined totalitarianism, the after effects of Nazism, and the influence of Soviet propaganda on the global South. Sam also edited Dr. Einat Wilf's book, We Should All Be Zionists, and is currently writing his own first book, which explores anti-Zionism, the nature of mass movements, and the ideological convergence between Islamist factions and the Western left. Now, if you listen to my last episode with Leib Edelman, you'll recall that Leib spoke about how anti-Semitism morphed into anti-Zionism in Poland around the late 1960s. Sam lived under the repressive communist regime in Poland and discussed the anti-Zionist mass movement in Poland that formed at that time. And as you listen to my conversation today with Sam, I invite you to make the connections and draw conclusions, as I think you'll find that what we are encountering in the West is very similar to what Jews encountered in communist regimes, namely the erasure of Jewish identity to fit into new constructions of the good Jew. With that, I want to welcome my guest, Sam, to Don't Know Much About. So thank you so much and welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me. It's good to be here with you.
Thank you. So before we get into the subject matter of your book that I want to really talk about and what you're studying and the ideological convergences between Islamism and the radical left, what I always like to do with my guests is I always want to go back to a kind of formative event that then catapulted their journey into, intellectually examining certain things. So for you, being from South Africa, I want to go back to your uh, experience in undergraduate, what you experienced there, and I'll stop with let's start with that.
Yeah. Well, I grew up, I went to a Jewish day school. So I always grew up around Jewish people and Jewish life. And I was connected to it in that way, but I wasn't connected to it in any sort of intellectual way or something I wanted to pursue as a career once I got into university. Um, and in the end of my first year, the Israel Hamas war in 2014 began. And I was not shocked when I saw the encampments after October 7th, because we had something very similar over a decade ago in South Africa. Literal encampments were set up. I've always made a joke. I've said South Africa is 10 years ahead than America when it comes to this issue. So basically what ended up happening was I decided to write a column for the university press while all of this was going on. I wouldn't say it was a particularly one-sided article. I think it was actually fairly balanced. But it led to me, in essence, being cancelled before cancelling was even really a thing. Complete social isolation from any of the groups and movements that I was part of. I was part of the liberal left, those, left of center, but total complete isolation from all the people I was studying with at the time, which ranged from, you mentioned that I did journalism, but I was also involved in different minors of philosophy and all of that, just total complete isolation. What this kind of put me in a position now is I felt, although we had the SOJAs, which was the South African Union for Jewish Students, and of course there were other Jewish students there. I mean, the Jewish population in South Africa, just for context, is 0.01% of the population. Okay, so it's a tiny minority, and you're a tiny, tiny minority at a university. So you're up against an ocean, basically. So in some ways, I felt like I was up against, 2,000 people. And I thought, well, I better get my facts in line here, and I better know what I'm actually talking about. So in a way, the response that I got from writing a fairly balanced piece that led to me being totally isolated and cancelled out of the kind of social circles that one wanted to be a part of in university actually led to me going down this career path inevitably and eventually. But at the same time, it actually led to me going and studying these issues much deeper. And I don't think if it wasn't for those people that led this kind of campaign, I actually not sure if I would have. I was very interested in going down different directions of journalism and interested in different topics at the time.
Wow, I thank you for sharing that. I also, while listening to you, I can't believe that um, in 2014 there were already these encampments.
Yeah,
Um, and something else you said that I want to kind of unpack together is that South Africa is ahead of the United States of America in terms of the anti-Zionist campaign. And something that you and I spoke about by phone before is you mentioned that in South Africa, the anti-Zionism was, I think you used the word institutional.
yeah,
Um, and I want to understand that. And the reason I want to understand that is because if it is indeed, and I believe you, that it is ahead of the United States of America, it can help us really prepare. But I have to also say that I think America has caught on, has is catching up in rapidly.
yeah,
So, but I still think I think it's important for our viewers and listeners to understand what you meant by becoming institutional. And also, I always interesting thing about Jews from South Africa, by the way, I did not know they constituted such a minority,
yeah.
but Jews from South Africa that I met are very Zionistic.
Hmm.
Just there's a huge population in Southern California where I used to live. And when I would encounter Jews from South Africa, they kind of reminded me of Jews from the former Soviet Union.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
I kind of wonder why that is. Is it because they really did experience the anti-Zionism? And so if you can give us a brief kind of almost history lesson on South Africa and when did anti-Zionism really appear there? How is
yeah.
it manifested? And what do you mean by it's institutional?
Okay, so the first thing about your point about it being what I said, it was 10 years ahead of America, and then saying that you feel like America is catching up quite quickly. I think that is true. I think America is catching up quite quickly. I think there's a few differences, and I'll start with recalling the 2001 Durban conference, where the protocols of the Elders of Zion were handed out outside the so-called anti-racist conference. That was in South Africa. That's where the BDS movement sprang from. Um, you've now got a movement there called Africa for Palestine, which is an offshoot of the BDS, and they're far more radical. I mean, they go and do visits in Tehran with the Ayatollah and the government in the Islamic Republic. Um, I think where uh, where this comes from is that a lot of the people who are in government or who have been in government over the last 2 years actually studied in the former Soviet Union. And they studied at the very institutions where Zionologists were hard at work drawing up these conspiracies. Um, One of the reasons that they were studying there was because there was apartheid, and Black South Africans could, of course, not study in South Africa. They were prevented from studying there. And the Soviet Union almost put out a friendly hand to the ANC movement. Not everyone in the ANC movement was pro the Soviets, but there certainly was a strand in the ANC movement that was pro Soviets, and that strand in the movement would later, after Mandela, post Mandela's presidency, become the real power players in the government. So, what I mean by it being institutionalized is not necessarily that it's state policy, but that where it's different in America. Put it this way: if you had Zoran Mamdani, you've got him now in New York as the mayor. But what happens if you had Zoran, someone like Mamdani, in three-quarters of government positions throughout America? We're speaking about a different level there. So this is really what I mean. The guy who was the mayor of Johannesburg, okay, he was the mayor of Johannesburg during October 7th. Johannesburg, for those that don't know, is the biggest city in South Africa. He was the head of Africa for Palestine, leading the encampments when I was there. He then became mayor, And within the same week of October 7th, literally posted a photo of himself with an automatic weapon, a Hamas flag saying Viva the resistance. Okay. This man is now in government. He's now progressed from mayor into government. Naledi Pandor, who was the foreign minister at the time, met with Hamas just weeks after October 7th, met with the Iranians just weeks after October 7th. The Iranians invested about $6 billion into the South African economy. Okay. And within about a month after that, the South Africans went and opened the ICJ case of genocide. So there, what I'm saying is that what you've got in South Africa is South Africa's government and its institutions are aligned with the Islamic Republic. And the members, why I said 10 years ahead is all these kids on campus, these students, what happens if they all become the next senators and congressmen? Well, that's what's happened already in South Africa. South Africa's already in that stage. Luckily, South Africa does have, because of its legacy of apartheid, very strong anti-discrimination laws. So it allows the Zionist Federation and all these movements to actually have fair trials against people spreading hate. They've won some, they've lost some. Some of them that they lost, they should have won, vice versa. But it's more entrenched in the members that are currently in the government than it is in America.
Yeah, that's important distinction because in my mind, when somebody says something is institutionalized, uh, that translates to policy and law. And what I'm hearing you say is that the government has become overrun by people who are anti-Zionist, but also who are aligning themselves with Islamist um, groups, sometimes even straight up
Well,
terrorist groups.
there is a Hamas headquarters in Cape Town.
Okay.
In
That
fact, yeah,
that's
that,
I remember that was something. Can you talk what that I'm sorry, I'm like very speechless right now. Can you explain that to me? How is there a Hamas? First of all, let's take a step back. In the United States of America, Hamas is a designated terrorist organization. In South
oh,
Africa, not.
no.
Okay. And that's as such, they are treated as
As a legitimate political
legitimate.
entity.
And so there's a Hamas headquarters in Johannesburg,
No, in Cape Town.
in Cape Town.
So the interesting thing is, after my studies, when I went to go work at the Cape Town Holocaust Center, I moved to Cape Town from Johannesburg. This is all pre me being here in Israel. And about a few blocks away from where I lived, we're talking now downtown. We're not talking some, strange, dodgy area. We're talking downtown. There's a building, and on the one side of the building has the BDS sign, and on the other side of the building has Hamas. And there were literal Hamas operatives, political operatives, you could call them, that were working within that building. The South African government, I mean, it's clear, the record is clear on this. They have met with Hamas over the years, countless times, legitimized Hamas, Hezbollah as well. They're very good friends with. There was Naledi Pandor, who was the foreign minister, was very good friends with Nasrallah. This is a known thing. So this is really what I mean. And look, where does the line go here? Because you can say, yes, if you open up the books of the South African Constitution, and if you open up the books of South African legislation, there's no explicitly anti-Zionist legislation in there, that Zionism is illegal or something like that. However, when you've got large parts of the government who are self-identified anti-Zionists, who are active members in Africa for Palestine and the BDS movement, who are literally politically collaborating with the Islamic Republic, collaborating with Hezbollah, collaborating with Hamas, that does actually translate into policy.
Right, of course. Of course. Policy like turning the blind eye on discrimination.
Policy turning a blind eye on discrimination. Look, I mean, here there was a thing a few weeks ago, on October 7th, in fact. I think it was on October 7th, but regardless, it was in the last few weeks. There was a protest held outside the Holocaust Center, okay, in which like explosives were thrown over the wall, and they were all put out and everything was fine, but fireworks and whatever. And this was in response to the Holocaust Center refusing to call the war in Gaza a genocide. So they decided that the right move to that was to attack physically the Holocaust Center. Not one person, not two people, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds gathered there, and they laid physical assault at the center. And the government was completely quiet about it. There was no legislative measures. There was no banning of an organization. There were no police there to sort out the problem. So that this is basically what I mean, is that it's not necessarily institutionalized in that there's actual state legislature explicitly anti-Zionist, but it is certainly state sanctioned.
Right. And how has the Jewish community in South Africa, would you say that they've retreated or they've doubled down on their Jewishness? How would you describe that?
I think it would depend on the individuals. I obviously still have family there. I think that the one thing that I could say about that differentiates South Africa, and this is more of a positive from what's happening in America, is that anti-Zionism is in the government in the way we've discussed, but it hasn't quite captured the culture as much.
Mhm.
Anti-Zionism is like the culture in America. It's the culture of the left. It's the culture of the academy. In South Africa, it's certainly the culture of the left and the culture of the academy, but of the average everyday person on the street, they're not interested at all. And this is one of the advantages of living in such an a disadvantaged, underdeveloped, unprivileged country. They, like a lot of the South
Right.
African
You've got a
population,
hierarchy of needs.
actually real problems,
Yes.
like where we're getting water, there's electricity, we don't have education, our 40% of the people are illiterate. Like they're not interested really in the same capacity as Americans are in some foreign war. That's the one distinction I'd make. So I think South African Jews are less, unless they're encountering it in government or they're encountering specifically from the movements, the anti-Zionist movements, or as they term themselves, the pro-Palestine movement. You're not going to walk down the street and feel it too heavily the way you might in some places in America, or certainly on university campuses over the last bit of time, 2 years. Um, so the chief rabbi of South Africa came out very strong. He went after the government. Like he didn't hold back, he didn't retreat. He was actually always very diplomatic. And he almost pushed it to the extreme where actually some people in the Jewish community like were actually very critical
Mhm.
of how much he was attacking the government. I don't necessarily agree with every point he made, but I agree with the sentiment. I think he as the leader of the community in that country, he needed to come out on the attack and could not retreat. But I think in general, the Jewish population is declining in South Africa. In the 90s, you had about 75,000 to 80,000 Jews in South Africa. You've now got under 50,000. Um, the last report I did was when I was living in South Africa, it was 53,000. But now we're talking about 7 years ago.
Mhm.
So it's definitely declined since then. So we're looking in the 40,000s. That's due to a few factors. That the population tends to be older, so there's a higher death rate than birth rate, but there's also mass immigration, and that's not only for reasons of anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism and what's going on with the thing, but there's a very high crime rate in the country. There's not a lot of opportunities. So there are a lot of Jews that are moving to Israel, and there's a lot of Jews that are moving to the UK. And traditionally, there were a lot of Jews moving to Australia. And as you mentioned, South California, I actually have some family there in San Diego.
Yes. I want to I want to use this time with you now to kind of retrace the assembly line of this anti-Zionism, but also this kind of aligning with terrorist organizations and third world liberation movements. And I want to kind of help my viewers and listeners to kind of make sense of that history.
Yeah.
You mentioned the Soviet Union, and I think it's really, really important. because here's what I'm going to say. Isabella Tabarovsky has done amazing work. She really was probably the first person in most recent years to bring to the West the story of the origins of
Mm.
anti-Zionism, tracing it back to the Soviet Union. Now, I've been reading and studying it as well, and I will say it's a kind of a bumpy story. It's not super clear, and it's a story. It's one of those stories like where do you begin? So, for instance, you know
Yeah,
this, but I'll just say this to educate the viewers and listeners. So, the Soviet Union initially was supportive of Israel and voted yes in the 1947 UN vote.
mhm.
Stalin, and this is really a story of Cold War kind of era politics.
Totally part of the Cold War. Yeah,
So you've got this guy Gromyka who goes to the UN and gives this speech using decolonization language, really, and saying, we support the Jewish liberation movement in Palestine and that we support the state, creation of Israel. And what happens is that Israel doesn't really perform in the way that the Soviets wanted. They decided we're not going to be your little puppet government in this
yeah.
proxy
They're
war.
aligned with the West.
And so it turns. I so what for me, I believe that the turn really happens in the 50s, in the mid to late 50s, and of course after the Six-Day War, the Soviets really start to begin this anti-Zionist campaign.
Yeah.
But with Africa, and there's another story that I think is important, which is Soviet Union. The goal was to spread communism. And I was curious if you had some insight as into, and I'm going to share my screen in a bit to show some posters.
Mm.
Why do you think the Soviets, from my research, invested so much in third world liberation movements, and how did it affect today's Western kind of proclivity for uh,
Mm.
decolonization?
Yeah. Well, there's a whole web here of things. So I think there's a whole web here of things, and then around that web we're using terms, and sometimes we're not being specific about them. One is the West, which is the centerpiece here of what we need to discuss about this transnational, the ability of this movement to be transnational, to find its way in Africa, to find its way in Asia, whatever. Transnationalism here is a very important key. And obviously, communism itself was a transnational universalist movement, the Communist International, right? So, the first thing here that we need to understand is that all these movements are anti Western, right? This is not a new discovery.
And
But what
and
do we
yeah, what does that mean though? Can you
yeah,
unpack
well, this is the thing. Yeah, what do we actually mean by the West? Because the term itself is elusive. Um, well, the interesting thing about anti-Westernism is that it is a Western phenomena, meaning it was birthed in the West by the West. And it was birthed dominantly through the fascist movements and the communist movements. They were essentially anti-Western movements. Now, that might sound strange because these are movements of Germany, or at least German philosophy, one could say. And one hesitates because one looks at liberalism and says, well, liberalism is a movement of the West, and it's a movement of modernity coming out of the Enlightenment. But that was not just the only movement that came out of the Enlightenment and wasn't the only modern movement. There were two other modern movements, one could say even more modern, that was fascism and communism. And fascism and communism were anti liberal revolts. Okay. And fascism and communism's appeal to movements in the global south, whether it was the Middle East or Asia or Africa, was in essence that who was the essence of liberalism? It was France and Britain. Who were the colonial empires of that time? France and Britain. So it begins with the enemy, perfectly practical. The enemy of my enemy is my friend. But people like to stop there. They like to stop there. And what they forget is if you look at a movement like the SSNP in Syria, the Syrian Socialist Nationalist Party, this is pretty much as close to Nazism proper as a Arab political party got. Um, the Ba'ath socialists as well, Ba'ath socialism, they were all Anton Sadeh of the SSNP. He was a lecturer in German philosophy. He was an expert in the same German philosophers that inspired the birth of fascism. The same is actually true of the Ba'ath socialists, who only adapted the socialist element later on. But in the beginning, they say we are creating this project as students of Fichte and Nietzsche, and so they're admitting where their influences are coming from. So it's easy from a Western point of view to look at these movements, same with the Islamist project, and see a vast panorama that looks entirely foreign. But if you look really closely at how these movements are set up, what ideologies birthed them, what philosophies birthed their politics, they're German. Okay, and they're German anti-Western movements, which means anti-liberal movements. And they were so easily brought into that because they were being colonized by the British or by the French. And what you notice in all these movements, whether it was the fascists in their own right, and the fascists also view themselves, they were imperialist in one way and viewed themselves as anti-imperialist in another. And the communists certainly put themselves as an anti-imperialist project, although they were also universalists at the same time. This, you can see the Islamists is the same thing. The Islamists actually paint themselves as an anti-imperialist, decolonial movement, and yet at the same time are looking to establish a caliphate in various parts of the world, or as far as they could in the world. But this anti-Western perspective is in essence what aligns them with the Western left today, the progressive front, the global left, whatever you want to call it. They all stem from this anti-liberal revolt.
But
Okay.
just slow you down for a second because I think it's really important. The anti-Western movement is birthed in the West.
Yeah.
Okay, which is mind.
Which is which is which is mind blowing, but not that mind blowing when you see how anti-Western the progressive front is today. What I'm just saying is that they have a lineage, and that lineage is in fascism and communism.
I see. Okay, and you would date it to the 1920s and the 1930s?
Well, yeah, it depends because if you want to look at the philosophers that inspired Lenin and the Bolsheviks, for example, or later Stalin, or you want to look at the philosophers that inspired the birth of Nazism or Mussolini, um, you could go back to the late 1800s. But as movements themselves, yeah, I would say the early 1900s upwards till about the 1930s, 1940s.
Uh-huh. And what what was their goal? Well, what was their goal in, okay, do you believe that their goal was to spread social unrest? I mean, what were they, what was their goal? I mean, okay, they
Well,
had
yeah,
theories. What was, but how would one operationalize these theories, these
yeah.
anti-Western theories?
Well, I mentioned that Britain and France at the time were colonizing a lot of these lands that we're speaking about. And the Middle East was a much shorter period than what was happening in Africa. In fact, the colonization of the Middle East is usually, especially by modern Middle Eastern studies, is vastly blown out of proportion in trying to examine the problems that exist in the Middle East today. But there's a few things. The one is that Britain and France were colonial empires, and but there was something deeper. Is let's look at Imperial Japan for a moment, because Japan is another one of these movements that employs a lot of its ideas from fascism. And they were also the people who built Imperial Japan, Emperor Hirohito and the state Shinto, all these ideas. They were poets and philosophers and intellectuals and academics of the Hegelian Romantic school. Okay, so they were very educated in Hegelian, like the process of history unfolding towards this final beginning, which is really what Marx was. Marx was heavily
Right,
influenced by
this
those ideas.
Helios. Hmm.
Yeah, the totalitarian movements really took on that idea from Hegel and went full throttle with it. Um, anyway, so the thing is about the Japanese is Japan, since about the 1850s, had undergone a massive liberalization process. Huge. They started basically bringing British naval strategies, French parliamentary systems, Western style dress, British and French academic systems. So a massive, massive liberalization process happened in Japan. The same liberalization process actually happened in Egypt. Okay, Egypt started having a multi-party system. Okay, you had Hoda Sharawi, who was the head of the Independence Party, the women's branch of the Independence Party, famously threw off her headscarf into the river, and there was a process of liberalization in the in the academy, in politics, in Egypt happening as well. And what you see at this time in Japan and Egypt, I'm using these two because they're from vastly different parts of the world, but there's a liberalization happening and then there's a revolt against that. So, what is the revolt in Japan? The revolt is the birth of Imperial Japan, Emperor Hirohito, the idea of returning to the ancient Japanese spirit that has been corrupted by what they called the modern. Now, in Egypt, what happens? The revolt against this liberalization period is the birth of the Muslim Brotherhood, which Hamas is a chapter of. And they are, in essence, an anti-liberal revolt. Their forefathers, the intellectuals, Hassan al-Banna, Said Qutb, they write about liberalism, and the West has brought a state of jahiliya, which is ignorance, pre-Islamic ignorance, back into the Muslim world. And what you basically are seeing there is these two phenomena happening. They're revolting against liberalism in the same way the fascists and the communists were revolting against the liberal system in Europe. And I'm saying that that's not by accident. I'm saying that these movements were heavily influenced, okay, in their politics and their outlook by the two totalitarian movements in Europe. So what connects them is that they're anti-liberal revolts, which is really what they mean by anti-Westernism. And this is the inheritance being brought down into the Western left today in their anti-Westernism.
Okay, well, here, I guess my challenge and defer to your knowledge here is, um, again, you're saying that these movements are really reacting to liberalism, and so they're taking on reactionary policies, politics, and ideas. But at the same time, as they are kind of reclaiming their ancestral, like who are we, our national spirit, you know, Muslim Brotherhood is birthed, I believe, in the 1930s.
1928 in Egypt.
1928, okay? And from what I understand, this is also the time where um, Arabs start kind of, flirting with communism as well.
Yeah, for
Like,
sure.
so how, in the pan-Arab world at the time, communism was really popular. But
Yeah,
communism is not returning back to your, Islamic. And so how do we explain that too?
yeah. So the communists, when it comes to communism being exported into parts of the global south, whichever part it is, it's fairly easy to actually notice because the communist project itself claimed to be international. It was an internationalist project. The fraternity of brothers, for example, when the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan, it was seen as an act of fraternity to uplift the comrades in Afghanistan who were elected in 1978 to government. The Communist Party in Afghanistan were the official government at that time. There was a whole bunch of rebellions and uprisings against them, and the Soviet Union went and actually invaded Afghanistan at that point, in one part as to make sure
Liberate the
that
workers.
to make sure that that government could remain in place and it wasn't collapsed by the upheaval, so that a pro-American government could be put in place. So that was part of their Cold War strategy. But the communist thing in the Middle East is easy to trace because of the very definition of communism, that it sought to actually place itself outside of its borders. The fascist impulse is very difficult to trace precisely because the fascists seem in every single way completely different to the communists. Where the communists were looking to export their project and it was international, the fascists insisted that in every fascist movement was inherently provincial, inherently local, and was birthed from the soil of that nation. Okay? So Mussolini was trying to rebirth the Roman Empire. Hitler was trying to rebirth the Roman Empire, but in an Aryan form. But it was a strictly German movement and a strictly Roman movement. And this is true in one sense. And then in another sense, what you start seeing in the Muslim Brotherhood and in the Ba'ath Party and in all these different movements is a lot of fascist principles creeping up and actually starting to take full shape within the movement. So when I spoke about the Muslim Brotherhood, what I'm actually speaking about is more of a fascist inclination than any communist inclination. And the communists were more involved, as you said, with the pan-Arab movement. But the Islamic movements were more fascist inclined. In fact, there was a Palestinian communist who actually, interestingly, learned a lot about communism from the Zionists who were immigrating here at the time. But he was imprisoned by the British for like radical communist activities, and he wrote a phenomenal tract about the infiltration of fascism into Islamic politics. So nothing that we're speaking about today is particularly new. It was forgotten because the West, in my perspective, told itself a story. And I think this runs very deep, the story. The story starts in the firestorms of 1945 with the defeat of fascism. And it continues till Francis Fukuyama comes out with his apparently prophetic book, The End of History, which is Hegelian in and of itself, that the Soviet Union has now collapsed, and this represents the end of communism. And the end of history is liberal democracy is the final point of our political evolution. Now, many people have misinterpreted what Fukuyama was saying there, and it's not necessary to go into the interpretations, the correct ones and the incorrect ones. But in essence, what comes from this is that communism and fascism are a thing of the past, and we're now entering the post-ideological age. That was true only so far as you looked at the world like this. But the minute you expanded your view in the world, fascism and communism were very much still alive in other parts of the world. But when a Westerner looks at the Middle East or looks at Asia, not so much Asia anymore, there's almost like a blinding light. Bernard Lewis, excuse me, the preeminent historian on the Middle East, phenomenal historian, by the way, the one who actually births the idea of the clash of civilizations, which Samuel Huntington borrows, did phenomenal work. But he went and he studied Muhammad's life, the Hadith, and all these Islamic precepts and concepts to try work out what went wrong. How did this happen? What is this movement we're looking at? And he comes up with some fascinating things, and all the scholars that went after him come up with these fascinating things. But one thing that very few people, many scholars of the early 2000s were actually doing, were actually looking at these movements and saying, is there anything familiar here? There was this desire to paint them as totally foreign, the panorama of the foreign that I spoke about. But there's also a panorama of something oddly familiar, and more than oddly familiar, in the sense of the Muslim Brotherhood is a fascist organization which follows the totalitarian mold to a degree. The one person who did this work, who is completely isolated by the renowned historians of the Middle East, was Paul Berman in his book, The Terror and Liberalism. Paul Berman in 2003, I think after 9/11, wrote about this. And I mean, the book was like a New York Times bestseller and it did very well. But Middle East affairs professors tend to dismiss him as a scholar because he's not a Middle East scholar or historian. But Paul Berman really tapped on something deep and fundamental that was happening in the Middle East, which was the, let's call it the Westification, but not the West, because it was the Westification, because there was the
Nazification.
liberal, yeah, but there was the liberal infiltration in the French model that was really influencing. This is what's interesting is most Middle Eastern studies professors. I'm not speaking now about the trend of the decolonial. We'll get to them, and the Orientalist idealists and whatever. I'm speaking more about the traditional guys. They find it not hard at all to look at parts of the Middle East and see that process of liberalization, for example, that we spoke about. And they say, yes, Egypt was undergoing the French model, they call it, right? There's no problem for them to see that. But when they need to see the German model, there's no, this is not German. This has got something to do with 1,400 years ago. Even the concept of jihad itself, the way in which it's carried out today, is far closer to George Sorel's reflections on violence than it is ancient jihad. Ancient jihad was a military battle fought and only proclaimed by the leader or the state head. It wasn't a state, but by the head of the ummah. But an individual to carry out violence and martyr themselves on behalf of a cause, that's the violence of romantic Europe in the late 1800s, early 1900s, not of Islam.
So let me pause you for a second. If I'm understanding you correctly, and you tell me if I'm not understanding you correctly, you're basically saying a few things, but one thing is um, this Islamism, this kind of tyrannical Islamism, can be attributed to its encounter with the West. And if it
Yes.
didn't encounter the West, perhaps it wouldn't have had such a um, tyrannical jihadist.
Yeah, I'm not saying that I'm not saying it's a backlash against the West, and that's the only reason it exists. That's kind of the
Not the backlash, but
yeah,
the influence of those ideas, rather, from
yeah. I mean,
German.
obviously, there's things when you read Sayyid Qutb, he wrote volumes and volumes of commentary on the Quran. Um, but his idea of overcoming the West, as he spoke about it, which what he was referring to was liberalism, was to create a vanguard, and the vanguard was a small group of people that were knowledgeable, that were going to create a violent uprising against the people responsible for the state of Jahiliyyah, the, the pre-Islamic ignorance. The vanguard is not a particularly Islamic word. In fact, I think it's Leninist idea.
Mhm.
That's
Yeah.
just that's a tiny example. And the other examples I spoke about is, you know, these guys, literally the leaders of these movements, for example, for Baath socialism, he said we were racists, admiring the Nazis from afar, studying their literature and their work, and seeing how we could implement it here. These things are there. I'm not saying that there is absolutely these are total Western movements. No. These are Middle Eastern movements, Arab movements, Islamic movements, who were greatly, greatly influenced by modernity.
Mm.
Okay, and have adopted and utilized and almost indigenized fascism and communism into their various different political entities. Okay,
Mhm.
so it's a hard thing to wrap your mind around, because our concept of the West is almost this. Our concept of this war is Huntington. It's the West versus Islam. It's a cultural block. It's a cultural war. I don't really believe that's what we're going through right now, because we're now dealing, in my mind, with the first mass movement of the 21st century. Okay. The anti-Zionist mass movement is what I'm terming it. And the reason I'm saying it's a mass movement,
Why do you put it in the 21st century and not the 20th century?
well, all of its ideologies and its origins come from the 20th century. But the particular phenomenon that we're seeing now, post October 7th, is not the same way. Yes, there were elements of it in Poland and whatever, and it was certainly state sanctioned in the Soviet Union, all these origins. But the way it exists now is a global cause that transcends a few things. It's transnational, okay? It totally breaks apart any sort of traditional political affiliation. We live in a polarized age where people worship the gods of the left and the right. And yet, we've stumbled into a movement that has Islamists, the left, right wing reactionaries that you could say are of a total neo fascist current, that are Muslim, that are Western, that are African, that are Asian, right? It's a global cause. So it's now a mass movement, is how I'm defining it. Mass movements were a thing of the 20th century, um, uh, at least typically. And of course, anti Zionism itself is a product of the 20th century.
Right.
But
So,
in terms of the way it's organized, I mean, if you look at the pro-Palestine movement now, it's not an Islamist cause, even though the Islamists are the vanguard. It's not a left-wing cause, even though the left-wing labor eagerly within it. It's not a neo-fascist current, even though people from that cause pledge support. So the one thing that unifies these people is anti-Zionism. It unifies people transnationally, cross-continental, and across political affiliations.
okay, two questions then. Then we must define what it is. What is then? I mean, I have a definition. What is it then? What is anti-Zionism that unites them?
Well, no, but this is precisely why I'm calling it the anti-Zionist mass movement, because it has specific principles. One of them is anti-Westernism, by which I mean anti-liberalism. I think it's fairly easy to acknowledge that the progressive left in America is anti-liberal. Anti-liberal in a very different way that the fascists were, or in a different way that the Islamists are. But they all unite on this principle that they're anti-liberal. Why? It's fairly simple. The liberalism is seen as a weak system holding the world back from utopia. Okay, liberalism is all about patience and reform. It's what is a mass movement? This is probably the question you're asking me. So a mass movement is not only transnational in that it has the ability to spread across the world and continents, but it breaks apart traditional group affiliations and brings adherents together under one idea and one collective
What is that
concept.
one idea? What is that one idea?
I think it's anti-Zionism, but anti-Zionism has branches that are representative of a few things. I think that the unification, Zionism for the Soviets, right, was like the tip of the spear of America. Okay, that was right. Zionism for the Islamists, okay, and the Jew for the Islamists was always blamed for liberal capitalism and colonialism. For the Nazis, okay, the Jew was always responsible for liberalization and capitalism and all this filth. So the Jew has long been in the imagination of anti-Western movements the symbol, the symbol standing in the way of us overthrowing
The
liberalism, overthrowing
Jew was
capitalism.
always a symbol, even in the 19th century. I always, I've, I always think that the
Oh,
Jew is a tool through which the world is either realigning their moral compass or thinking through things, but the Jew always represents something else.
well, that's because you know Christianity and Islam, in their own right, um, were birthed as their self-conception is largely based on the negation of the Jew. These issues, I think, are very deep and very daunting to go down. Yeah.
I think you're onto something interesting here because just to bring us back, my area again is Soviet Union and trying to
Mm.
make sense of this Soviet anti-Zionist campaign. And I think you're right in the sense that you identified that Zionism really was a tip of that tool or the spear to go after America and the capitalist bourgeois. Um, now,
And Palestine or Zionism was the symbol seen as the symbol, the front runner of American imperialism. And Palestine, okay, and anti-Zionism was the tip of the spear from which we would defeat the West and American imperialism.
Exactly, exactly. Just recently I was teaching my class on the history of anti-Jewish movements, and I was explaining to my students that it's not simply that the Soviet Union wanted to have a foothold in the Middle East and because of oil.
Yeah.
It's not that simple.
No.
They wanted to create the Palestinian movements precisely for that, because that would become that dagger that would take down America. And so, it makes a lot of sense for me that when I walk around in the streets and I do encounter anti-Zionist mobs, and I look at the people who embrace this movement, most of them have no clue. They have no clue of the history, because the Soviets did a phenomenal job, because they coded Palestine and Zionism in a way to ship to these people who they live in the West and they hate the West.
Mm-hmm.
They wanted to take it down.
Yeah.
So it,
Well,
it
this is why they're burning American flags at the same time they're burning Israeli flags, right?
that's right.
And they're speaking about the downfall of America, and American imperialism needs to be killed off and capitalism needs to be collapsed. So it's fairly easy to understand if their worldview is anti-Western. We're calling it now again anti-Western, but we've already gone on to speak about what that really means. And then if you've got the same enemy and you've got the same um, perception of the world, because it's more than just an enemy, but if you've got the same perception of the world, that the society to which you belong and its structures is inherently evil,
Mhm.
and smashing it down lies utopia. The Islamists believe that. The Islamists believe that to kill off the Zionist project will bring on the caliphate.
That's right.
The progressives believe that to kill off America and capitalism and imperialism will bring on this kind of post-colonial utopia. And the Soviets did a phenomenal job at painting Israel as a colonial project. The one thing that I'll say that the Soviets couldn't have done without people like Fanon, because Fanon actually never really spoke about the Jews or Israel and whatever, but in order to get people celebrating October 7th, you needed two things to happen. You needed people to think that Israel embodied the symbol of today's evil, which is identified as colonialism. And you needed people to think that violence against the colonialist
It's
is a
just
means of purification, which is Fanon. And therefore, when you combine those two elements, you basically arrive at October 8th, with the Democratic Socialists walking through, chanting resistance is justified when people are occupied. And, even some swastikas went up there. I don't know if you know about that, but American flags burning, Israeli flags burning, chanting the number 700, which at that time was the count of Israel's dead. This is how you get there. I mean, I think that we,
what
in
can I,
our
why do
community,
you think, let me ask you a different question. Why do you think these ideas are so infectious? Is it because they're eschatological in the sense that they provide almost a religious experience?
totally, this is what I wanted to speak about with the mass movement.
Okay.
So, so what is a mass movement? So I'll break down some fundamentals of what it is. The first thing is adherence to a mass movement, and this is I've done a lot of studying of the mass movements of the 20th century, and I've tried to look at some commonalities. I've tried to, in the beginning, take away the doctrine. Let's take away the specifics of the doctrine and just look at what formulates the mass movement and its followers and its leaders and its thinkers. So the first thing to understand is that a mass movement can only be created once the existing institutions have been discredited. Okay, for example, and go way back. Christianity could have not made its inroads, okay, into Rome in the way it did without the great Greek philosophers already discrediting and ridiculing the pagan cults of that time, prepared the ground for the bringing in of Christianity, of something new, of something that was offered. When we looked at Japan, we spoke about that liberalization process. The liberalization process was very good for a period of 50 years. And then after World War I backfired. Okay. And all of a sudden you had massive immigration coming into the center of the country from rural areas, which led to huge amounts of poverty. Okay. So there was this kind of desire to revolt against that. That allowed for the Shinto thinkers and whatever to come along and offer the vigor of the Japanese spirit to return to the old while rebirthing the new, which is a fascist principle. But I don't want to get too, I want to try to just get through it. So it requires people, usually academics, writers, men of words, women of words, let's say as well. Typically in the 20th century, it was men of words who have discredited the existing institutions. It also requires among its followers a guilty conscience, okay? A guilty conscience and a sense of sin. And the movement then offers itself, okay, as almost a point of salvation. To join the movement is to repent. Okay, once you're part of this movement, you are repenting for your sense of sin because you are guilty and you are part of the corruption of this of the present. The other thing is that the movement has to offer itself not only as a form of repentance, but it always offers a glorious future. Okay, and it does so because the past is corrupt. So the present is corrupt. So the present is basically a broken down train station. There's no fixing it. It's just a broken down train station from which we board to head on our way to utopia. That is a very, very, very vigoring. That is like a mind that makes the human mind do insane things. Okay, and in the 21st century, we have lost our ability to understand how ideas of salvation and utopia, that on the other side of all of this, we're birthing a new world, the destruction that's brought about. Today, we're political realists. We're arguing over polarization. Ideas matter, but it's more about culture, and it's right versus left, and it's all this stuff. But the ideas that shape a mind and a movement are very, very, to me, are far more important than that. And the other thing that needs to happen is that it has to have the ability to become transnational and cross-continental. So it has to offer a doctrine that has a universal enemy. So it's a devil in essence, because the devil is responsible for the corrupt present, which is why in every single case, whether it was the fascists or the communists, where the system of liberalism was their enemy, the Jew was the face of the system of enemy, because the Jew was the devil responsible for the corrupt present. Corrupt present, painting a picture that the present is corrupt is very important. And I wanted to say one more thing about this. Why do we struggle to understand how to deal with revolutionaries in a mass movement? Precisely because I'm a liberal, right? And what do I see? I don't see the present as corrupt. I see the present, like all liberals, as a natural outgrowth of the past with something that is going to gradually move towards a better future. And that's what the idea of liberalism is in reform. Conservatism is interestingly somewhat different, but somewhat similar in that it sees the present as also a natural outgrowth of the past, but it doesn't think that the future can get any better, so it wants to protect the present. So both the liberal and the
And
conservative,
the past, they want to conserve literally.
they want to
Yes.
conserve the past because it exists in the present and the future can't get any better than the present. So both the liberal and the conservative are interested in safeguarding the present. The revolutionary, you can't buy them off because the present to them is innately corrupt. They're only interested in the glorious future that's awaiting them once, which is why you see people do ridiculous things like trying to, even here in Israel, the Israeli government allowing Qatari funding to go into Hamas because they thought it could neutralize them, it could buy them quiet. All of these things are part of liberal conservative policies that are trying to buy off the revolutionary. Okay. But the revolutionary can't buy off a revolutionary. Give them $1 billion. They'll only take it if it's the means from which they can use to continue the march.
So what you're saying is that you're uh, portraying as sort of a dilemma, which is people like myself, and I gather like yourself, we want to preserve the present. We see the present as an outgrowth of the past, and
Yeah.
sure, there are certain things that are unhealthy, but we do not see it as a dilapidated train station that is in
Yeah.
need, or we don't want to burn it all down.
Yeah,
Whereas
exactly.
these revolutionary movements, or you call them social movements, right? They see this moment, this present, as this ripe opportunity to bring in this vision of the world that will bring them to salvation. Um, it's interesting that you say that. I think that there's another thing that is as a kind of a prerequisite of all this is that I think that they're able, this is what I said. I think that they're able to bring in their revolutionary ideas when the old systems are really falling apart. And I'll tell you
That's
that,
what I meant about the systems needing already to be I can't remember the word, discredited. The,
yes,
the current systems already have to be discredited.
yeah, that's really, really important because one of the things that Lenin said about the revolution was that he famously said it was on the ground. All you had to do is pick it up.
Exactly.
Um,
Exactly. And he
and
also said something interesting about if we started the revolution 15 years ago, it never would have worked.
Interesting. That's another
I can't remember
really
the
that.
exact quote, but I actually read it a few weeks ago in a.
So here's my question then. Do you think our institutions are breaking apart? Is that why this anti-Zionist global movement is so very successful? Is because the institutions are really crumbling?
Yeah. I'm not saying all the institutions. I think Western academia, in particular, not all of it,
Which
but
is
the
kind of ironic because Western,
humanities, the
well,
humanities,
mhm,
yeah,
yeah.
I think they're finished. Basically, in my opinion, there needs to be more than a massive reform. There needs to be an a total re recalibration of what's being taught there. They're no longer teaching Camus, but they're teaching Fanon, for example. You know, I mean, you can study Fanon, but once you start saying that Fanon's ideas are a pretty good thing for you to take out onto the street, well, what do you think you've got? You've got people who understand the idea of violence as purification.
Mhm. So then, I mean, let's take this conversation to the next step, which is strategy. What is the strategy then? And I'll tell you, here in the United States of America, and I'm speaking within the Jewish community, really, within the Jewish community, which is always struggling and to prosper because they're trying to align themselves always with
Yeah.
progressive causes or conservative. Um, there are movements in America within the Jewish conservative movements that believe that our savior is the West, that if
Mm,
we preserve the West, if we build institutions, because as you say, the humanities and the current institutions, the current universities are so very decrepit,
mm.
and teaching, no, they're no longer teaching, let's say, as you say, Camus,
But
fine.
but the men of who were the men of words that brought on such a self-deprecating concept of their own civilization? It was Edward Said and all these and Fanon and all these people, right? So this is part of the what I spoke about. The men of words have to discredit the institutions before a
Yes.
movement can even come about.
I understand, but what I'm kind of thinking right now, which is there is a big movement within, I'm not talking about progressive Jews right now. I'm talking about conservative Jews in America who believe that they believe as follows. And I have to tell you, I also kind of would say I believe this as well. That anti-Zionism is not a phantom of itself. It's not its own kind of self-producing project, that it is a byproduct of this red-green alliance or radical leftism or these ideas that we discussed, the 1920s ideas in the West Germany. And so because anti-Zionism is not like it's not as I say, a self-producing project. The conservative Jews say two things in America. They say we have to go, but it's not enough to fight this anti-Zionism. We have to look at the system that produces the anti-Zionism, and we have to,
Yeah, I agree with that.
okay? Subsequently, what they also think is if the universities are collapsing because they adopt anti-Western attitudes, naturally the answer is building universities like Barry Weiss is, University of Austin, Texas, building universities that celebrate the best that the West has ever given. What are your thoughts about that?
I, my comment about the institutions being in a bad place was not me saying that I'm against the institutions themselves. I think that institutions are critically important, especially in a democracy. There's serious, you know, the university. The problem with the university is it's never prepared people for a life that actually exists in the real world. That's the real problem with university, and it's always been that, but it's a hell of a lot worse today. Um, I come from that world, and I've been out of that world for a while now. Like from post university, I was involved in. Now I work more in an institute, so it's totally private. I I'm not. I must say that if there's one place I'm very pessimistic about, it's the university. Uh, I'm very pessimistic about it. Um, I think that I think that government institutions can, if handled in the right way, exactly what you're speaking about with what conservative movements are looking at. Media, for example, exactly what Barry Weiss did. Free press is a phenomenal publication. So there is the one argument of creating counter forces for sure. Um, then there's the other argument of reforming the existing institutions, which I think is also important because something like the New York Times is not going to lose the facade of being the New York Times like this, right? They've held prestige around the world for too long to kind of make just a seer of hundreds of errors throughout this war and somehow be discredited, which is their power in that they can just say, well, oh, that was a mistake and move on. And everyone reads the next article because it's from the New York Times and doesn't think twice about maybe this one's false, right? So I'm not an expert on what should be done on institutions, so I don't necessarily profess to have the answers there to that. It's not really this school of thought or projects I'm involved in doing. I just know, like everyone, that there's a big institutional problem. The institutional problems are very different in England than they are in America, so you can't put a one size fits all. But when it comes to university, which is the institution that I'm more intimately familiar with, let's say the humanities, I'm not positive about that. Like, I don't see, unless there was a total collapse of those, of the programs as they exist and a rebuilding of them, I don't see it getting any better. I think it only gets worse.
Okay, well, you're making a very good point, which is that certain institutions are going to retain their prestige. The New York Times is the New York Times. Harvard is Harvard.
Yeah.
So, throwing your eggs in the basket of like, down with those systems, we're just going to create new ones. To reform the existing institutions, that's a really tough job because that
All going to be
requires, I
really
would
tough.
say, a new, uh, just new people because, you know, the people make the institution. And
Well, you could start with one way. You could start with, I mean, I'm going to be quite blunt about this. Which of the professors are receiving salary from Qatar and fire them?
right,
That's
but
where
it's
you
not
could
illegal.
start.
It's not illegal to receive, it's that's the other problem is
Yes, but I think that I understand that it's not illegal, but I think that a university can make a decision that there's a nefarious influence that's happening here, and our prestigious institution is being used for nefarious foreign reasons, and they can look. I mean, here's the thing, okay? The university found no problem firing someone for refusing to call someone a he or a she when they're identified when they were trans, but it has to go through 1,000 loopholes to fire someone who celebrated October 7th. So it's not a question of that they can or they can't. They can when they have the will to, and they don't, and they when they don't want to, or when it's not convenient for them, they won't.
you're right. I also think there's another element here, which is something that I've talked about, which is the university administrators, leadership, anybody who's really in education, because they've grown up on education that's I mean, I know we're using that term loosely, but bear with me, anti-Western. Everything is coded. People become characters. For instance, Qatar is represents the almost the non-white. It's the
Yeah.
noble savage. And
Yes.
so going after Qatar seems very hard for them because it means going after the non-white. And also, if you yourself are in leadership and believe that America should be dismantled, you kind of want to align yourself with Qatar. So that's why I do say that you have to have a change in leadership.
Yeah, completely. No, no. I mean, look, it's not as simple as it's a lot of work. It's going to take a lot of time.
But they did a very
To
good
be
job.
honest, to be honest, I think it's going to have to come from inside. It's going to have to come from. I'm not. I'm not sure that massive external pressure will change things. It will certainly change some things. But I don't, if we're talking about a real change where these institutions go back to being institutions of not learning what to think, but learning how to think, um, that's going to take a lot, right? I mean, I remember when I was at university, tell me how you feel about this, because I know you do lectures and you were obviously at university. And I remember there were some professors, I didn't know what the hell they thought. I don't know. For all I know, he could have been a fascist or a Marxist that when he was teaching me about this. I had no idea. And then there were other professors, and this was the majority, who I knew exactly what they thought and why they thought that. And they would make me feel like I was not a great person if I didn't rally for that. There was something somewhat, I was somewhat morally damaged for not thinking the way they felt. So when your professors become activists, you have a problem. That's what I've always said.
I completely agree with you. And you may not disagree with me, but here's what I'm going to say. This is something I've been thinking about recently is I think that the politicization of the university and the professors who see themselves first and foremost as political agents or activists, I could draw a line back to, or I could bring it back to the formation of certain studies programs, like women's studies, gender studies. Um, these programs who nestled themselves into the university actually created a pipeline of activists. They didn't produce scholars, they produced activists. So it's actually quite genius. They are housed in universities, they're
Yeah,
pseudo intellectual, but they're actually a pipeline for activists.
yeah,
So the discipline fields themselves have radically changed, and you've got centers that are working within university that are they're not really producing scholarship. They are actually functioning as, as I say, keep a pipeline for production of activism.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, the amount of papers that come out of the university today, which are just patently like you can read them and you can be like, this is surely you can't verify this. Like surely there's no sources for you to make this claim. And yet it comes out and it comes through and it's done and whatever. There was a phenomenal book a few years ago, I think. Oh, the names escape me. If I remember, I'll bring it up. But the whole point of the book was two writers who were previous university professors, if I'm not mistaken, that wrote a whole bunch of submissions to
Yes,
the top universities.
I think it's
And
Peter Boghossian.
yes, that's exactly who it was. I read that years ago and I laughed throughout the whole thing of it
Right, they
because
were able to get it peer reviewed and published.
there we go. And, you know, just it just kind of shows you that's kind of what I meant by I'd have lecturers who I knew exactly what they thought, why they thought it, and why I should attend this protest outside there. I didn't pay to go to university. Or when I was trying to study, you know, about when I was learning about, let's say, Marx, and I I don't need you to be telling me exactly what protests I need to go to and why I need to go to it. Teach me about Marxist theory and get on with your day and let me get on with my day. If I want to go to that protest, it's painted all over the university. I know where to go. I don't want a lecturer, a professor telling me what I need to think. I just want a lecturer teaching me actually how to think. And that was the one thing I regret about university. I feel like all the things that I learned came from almost having to unplug myself from a lot of the things I learned in university. So when people say to me, "Oh, I'm worried about going to university," I'm like, there's an amazing guy named Eric Hoffer who wrote one of the most popular books in the 20th century, popular intellectual books of the 20th century, who was completely self-educated. I don't know. All the important things I learned were from books and things that I read after university.
University. That's right. Well, wonderful. So, as we wrap up, two things. You recently published a Substack in which you call for a real field to emerge to study anti-Zionism. Um,
which is now contradicting almost what I've just said about the university, but in
yes,
a
I
way.
guess. Uh, I agree with you. I just and I think it's important. Two things. I think that there have been look. I think that there's great scholarship. Like for instance, Jacques Gervais wrote the anti
Amazing.
amazing book which went out of print. Jean Amari also wrote about
Yeah.
anti-Zionism.
I got his book here, actually. It's very good.
It's very interesting. So um, Robert Wistrich, of course, the foremost scholar on
Yeah.
anti-Jewish movements. I think that as things come into fashion, and it feels like a little bit anti-Zionism, and I'm even seeing myself like I'm writing more about it. Um, my only reservation is I think not to lose sight of what I said earlier, which is that it's not a self-producing ideology. I think that if we study it, we must also understand from where its legs grow, as they say in
Yeah.
Russian. So,
100%. That's definitely part of the field of study. This is why I refer to anti-Zionism as a mass movement and not an ideology.
oh, I
The
like
idea
that's an interesting distinction. That's very
Yeah,
interesting.
and this obviously I'll go into this in the book and why that's about and exactly what a mass movement is and how it's formed. But yeah, I think you know what I wrote that article. I wrote it actually quite quickly. I wrote it like quickly I had an idea. I wrote it in an afternoon and published it, and it got some good traction. But what I did see was a recurring kind of misunderstanding of what I was actually saying. Some people say, "Oh, but there's Isabella and Jacques Chivay and Jean Marie," and the actual point I made was not that there aren't people that have done this. What I actually said was there's libraries full of books on Israel, on Zionism, on Israel's dreams, its wars, its aspirations, and its hopes, its history, and its present. And if you compare the amount of books written on anti Zionism in comparison to Zionism or to Israel, there's almost nothing.
Hmm.
That was the point that I was making.
Hmm.
Not that there's no one who's written about this before, and of course there's people that have written about this before, and there's people writing about it all the time now. It's getting published every single day. What I meant is that I want to walk into a library and I want to be at least able to see two bookshelves full of books on anti-Zionism, on its history, on the ideology, where it comes from, the Soviet involvement. Where does the decolonial theory come in, the settler colonial theory? I want to see shelves of books on this, right? Not, being able to refer to Givet and Jean Marie. We've got two books there that we're kind of speaking about. And of course, there's a few others here. But, if you've got.
You're right. Look at if you go to any, not even a library, about bookstore on the Holocaust, you've got shelves and shelves.
Precisely, that was precisely the point. It's like I could create my entire house, put every single book ever written on the Holocaust, and it would fill everything in my house. Maybe the same can be said for Israel itself, Israel and Zionism. Anti-Zionism, I could put two or maybe three books on a shelf and call it a day. And that was really the point that I was making. And some people were actually quite offended by that article. I've been doing this work for a decade, or that wasn't really the point I was making at all, that it's not being spoken about. But yeah.
And so, what is the book that you want to write about, or you are already writing?
Well, yeah, what I'm most interested about is anti-Zionism as a force, okay, a political force in the 21st century today. And of course, it's going to trace the origins of it, and I'll speak about the industrialization of anti-Zionism in the Soviet Union, and speak about the various forms of it, Nazi, Islamist faction forms, various different types, and paint this picture about the West and the modern, basically meaning liberalism and the different anti-liberal revolts, which were also modern phenomena that we spoke about earlier. I'm interested in painting that historically today to the anti-Zionist movement, but I'm calling it a mass movement rather than an ideology, because I want to basically see what is it that can take a left-wing progressive, a right-wing reactionary racist, a zealous Muslim conservative into his stream an Islamist radical, okay, as well as like someone in Africa and Asia and the Middle East and any country in Europe, and throw them all into one group with one political vision. That's an interesting phenomena in a world where everything is supposedly divided between right and left.
You know
We
what's interesting in the people that you named, and I think that reveals the answer. You didn't say, okay, you said the radical imam, the leftist, the right-wing Islamist, the person in Africa, but you didn't say the Christian, the white Christian, let's say, person.
well, there's strands of that happening as well.
Right, 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 right.
And this is the point: is what is it? And I think like this was the lesson of the 20th century, was that traditional cultures, national allegiance, and political categories, creeds, whatever you want to call it, can totally collapse upon the signifier of a mass movement. I'll give you one quick example. There was a guy named Jacques Derrida, who was a French head of the French Communist Party at one stage, becomes elected mayor of Saint Denis in 1934. The pinnacle of the French communist has a fight with the other leadership, leaves the party. 2 years later, starts a new party, which becomes now in 1936, becomes the largest fascist party in France. He goes and offers Hitler to fight on the front lines on the Eastern Front in German uniform. Now, that's an interesting phenomenon. How did a extreme leftist go all the way to the extreme right, be willing to die in an apocalyptic war in another country's uniform that is occupying his country. This is psychologically interesting. How did Mussolini start out as a really extreme left? He was a socialist. He was, in fact, the editor of the largest Italian socialist magazine at the time. How did he go to the extreme right? And what ideas from the extreme left did he bring with him when he was creating Mussolini's fascism? What ideas did he bring across with him? Right? So today we really do live in a polarized world. But how is it that at the same time we're living in a world where everything is about the left and the right and people praying to the gods of the left and the right, that at the same time
Well,
the
there are
largest,
signifiers. Well, there are
yeah,
certain groups, and
yeah,
unfortunately, one of them is the Jew and the signifier of the Jew. One
always,
always.
always, always going to be, because it's a civilizational symbol, right? All the sins of oneself are projected onto the Jew, right? This is true. Just open a period of history in just any book, and you can find that really. But basically, what I'm saying is the thing that I'm going to investigate in this book is that at a time of incessant increased polarization, where everything seems to be divided between the left and the right, the largest mass demonstrations the world has ever seen, because there's been 50,000 of them in just about every single continent since October 7th, cannot actually be described as purely left wing, purely Islamist, purely right wing. People like to say, the left. Yeah, the left definitely labor eagerly within it. The Islamists definitely, I mean, Hamas is the vanguard of this mass movement, let's call them that. And certainly Islamist factions throughout the West are no doubt doing that work. You've got, Candace Owens and reactionary racists and, neo-fascists pledging allegiance to this and sometimes going and actually joining the marches. But it's not a purely left-wing cause. It's not a purely right-wing cause or purely Islamist cause. It's a little bit of everything revolving around something. Certain movements are more active in it, like the left and the Islamists. They're more active in the right. But if this was a strictly left-wing cause and Islamist cause, then why on earth would a Christian nationalist be pledging allegiance to the cause in this supposedly polarized era that we're living in? I think that's a very interesting psychological phenomenon. And I think that 2023, October 7th, 2023, was as much of a life-changing moment in politics and culture of the 21st century as there's actually ever been. I think it's going to be a complete cultural shift in how we understand things. If everything was understood before as left versus right, I think things are going to start now getting blurred. There's going to be this transnational understanding of politics and culture, which is really very 20th century. And I think it's going to take some time. And this is kind of part of literature that I'm trying to at least contribute to the literature on that, of what I see is existing now and is going to be something that we're going to be increasingly dealing with going forward.
Fascinating. Thank you so much. I also I found a lot of what you said so very mm, striking, especially kind of the distinctions that you draw between ideology and social movements, and looking at
Yeah, it's important.
anti-Zionism in that way is very, very is intriguing. I also found it very interesting when we discussed how anti-Westernism is born in the West. So that was quite fascinating.
Yeah,
And you corrected me, so I appreciate that the Muslim and or Arab embrace of these Western ideas is not so much that encounter with the West as it was with modernity. And I thought that was a really important distinction there. So
yeah.
I've learned so much myself from this
Well,
conversation.
I learn a lot from you, so
So
mutual.
thank you so much, and thank you for tuning in on this amazingly just rich conversation that I just had with Sam. How could people follow you?
Well, a few ways. Instagram, Samuel J. Hyde. Um, Twitter, Samuel J. Hyde with an 11, because apparently someone stole my name. So there's an 11 there. And then also, where I do a lot of my writing is on Substack. So my Substack is called Beyond Belief, or you could just type in my name and subscribe there. That'll be great. I would appreciate that.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for tuning in. Until next time.